Meet me. Welcome back, boys, and welcome to class. I promised you guys this would be coming. It took a long time for me to break this down into digestible topics, but your curriculum is now ready. You're now enrolled in RTA University, and your professor is none other than Dr. Squirrel. Of course, credentials are important to us here at RTA University, but have no fear. For those of you unfamiliar with who I am, your professor is an ex-legend RTA player who finished in the top 100 at the end of Skyward season. Here's the proof, here's the frame. And I have faced the very best Epic 7 players out there, all legend players, the world champion. So no worries, this is not some peasant guide written by some mid-champion schmuck. This guide is the real deal and has been tested at the highest levels by me. I'm also a squirrel, so obviously it's trustworthy. This is going to be a long video because RTA is a very complicated topic. I can't cover everything there is to know. That would take days, but the goal here is to ingrain the proper fundamentals in you so that you can expand and grow upon them through your own World Arena experiences. And as always, I break my guides down into topics for your convenience so you can skip to the section that interests you. My recommendation is that experienced RTAers skip part 1, as it's tailored for newbies, but sections 2, 3, and 4 should have decent nuggets of information for all of you. So without further ado, let's get into the topics. So section 1 will just be Introduction to World Arena. That's for the newbies out there who might not have even stepped foot into World Arena, going over how it works, battle frenzy, basics like that. Part 2 is going to be what a lot of you guys are interested in, and that's going to be drafting theory. How do you pre-ban? How should you draft? What should you ban in the ban phase? How do you play mind games? Stuff of that nature. Part 3 will be battle decisions, maximizing your EV or expected value, and general advice. So, yeah, pretty basic stuff there. And part 4 will be specifically for those of you who are attempting to push Legend, some kind of advanced tricks and cheats that might help you out with that, as well as an overview of what that actually looks like. So if you guys are not interested in pushing Legend, just skip that and just watch parts 2 and 3. So let's get right into it. Let's get started, class. Take out your pens, your notebooks, and prepare to open up your brain holes and any other holes that are helpful to your education, except your butthole. Keep that one closed. Let's get started. Alright, so part 1, Introduction to World Arena. The first topic here is going to be, what is World Arena and why is it hard? We don't have to spend too much time on this because most of you already know. But for you super new players out there, let's summarize it real quickly. World Arena is the premier PvP content in Epic 7. Unlike Arena or Guild Wars, you fight other players in real time, not just stupid, brainless AIs. This is why Legend Arena frames and top 100 GVG frames don't get anywhere near as much respect as a Legend RTA frame. It's because those are way easier to get, because all you have to do is abuse AIs. You will go up against the best players in the world, and success is dictated on 3 main things. 1, your hero pool, 2, your gear, and 3, last but not least, your brain. The brains part is why it's hard. Unlike GVG and Arena, you can't just craft an offense that hard counters the defense. People are going to react to you. They're not going to do dumb things like just attack whatever they have elemental advantage against. And they're going to make the best possible play every time to try and crush you. So if you don't draft well, you're going to lose. If you don't make in-game battle decisions well, you're going to lose. So yeah, definitely the hardest PvP content in the game. So why do people do it? Really just for the glory. The rewards are pretty poop, to be honest, so if you don't care about glory, you can just stay away. At the end of the season, if you hit Masters, you'll get a special skin for a certain unit. Not a big deal. And you only need Masters for that, so that's what most people go for, and then they just stop. And after that, for each tier, you will get a special frame to brag about your awesomeness. Here are the brackets on the screen. Top 100 get Legend. This is new, but top 1000 get this Emperor frame now, which didn't exist in the past. 2000 rated plus players will get Champion, and down the list you goes. Essentially, the harder the accomplishment, the better looking the frame. But again, The rewards are really not that fantastic if you don't care about glory. So new players, perfectly viable to just completely skip it. There's no rewards until the end of the season, so if you don't care, no reason to participate until the last week. Let's move on. Battle Frenzy overview. Alright, now let's explain Battle Frenzy real quick, because a lot of players don't understand it. It's actually very simple. This chart tells you everything you need to know, so we're not going to dwell on it too much. One very important thing to note is that they change how Battle Frenzy works between seasons sometimes, and it has huge implications for the meta. So if you watch this video at a future point, this chart may be outdated. I'm just warning you, you might want to look at an updated chart. But the simple premise is this. RTA would be boring if people just stood there tanking and healing forever, which is pretty much exactly what happened in Season 1. So Battle Frenzy basically incentivizes offense by making heroes hit harder, effect resistance not work, healing heal less, more as the battle progresses. So basically, this is how Smilegate controls the pace of the match. They don't want people to stand there healing forever. They want you to try to kill enemies, and if you're not doing it fast enough, Battle Frenzy is going to make sure it happens, because eventually even your Soul Weavers will basically be able to one-shot anyone in the game. So that's all you really need to know about it. If you want to know the exact numbers, we're not going to talk about that. Look at the chart. But basically, this is just saying don't try to stall people. It's not going to work out well, unless, of course, they change these values at some point in the future. Let's move on. Now let's talk about general hero pool requirements. Basically, this is when are you ready to even step foot into the world arena? So this is my premise. First, you're going to want these components. 3 solid knights, 5 solid DPS units, 2 solid soul weavers, and 3 solid utility picks. Now, obviously, if you're like a high champion legend player, you have way more than this. This is the bare minimum to have any kind of success and get to masters pretty easily. Because if you have less than this, you're going to struggle, you're going to have a hard time winning matches, and you're probably going to get frustrated and just end up quitting. So this is the core that you need to succeed. And by solid, I mean meta units that actually work well. So like Knights, you can have like Prow, Adventure Raz, FCC, DPS units, things like RB, Spectre Tenebria, Landy, Ravi, whatever. Solid Soul Weavers, things like Diane or Ruel or Maid Chloe or even a Katie's or a Momo if you're really budget. And utility picks are things like Basar, F10A control heroes or Flurry or General Purges. You're going to need all these components to be able to react to people's picks, to be able to pick knights and damage mitigation if they happen to take the thing you have. Like, for example, let's say you had one solid knight and it was just Crow, and the other guy takes Crow first. Then you basically have no knight options, right? So if you are pigeonholed into only having one of any role, you're screwed from the start if they pre-ban it or take it. So it's always important to have a few dupes of that role so that you have options when it comes to the drafting phase. And that's pretty much it in terms of hero pool. That's the base. If you have that, you can probably get to masters if those heroes are geared and like anything close to decent. So that should be your starting point. Let's move on. Let's talk about general gear requirements. Now this is tough because depending on whether you're trying to bruise or cleave, like the kind of gear you need is very different between playstyles, right? Like control players obviously need a lot of effectiveness gear. But I'm going to make the most general assessment possible because one thing that's normal is that pretty much everyone who is playing this game is chasing this lovely stat here, right? Speed. Everyone's always chasing the speed rolls. So I'm going to base my opinion of your general quality of gear based on the fastest hero you can make. So this is what I came up with. If you can get a hero to 230 speed, your fastest hero, you should probably be able to make masters. If you can get it to 250 speed, you should be able to hit challenger. 270 speed, I mean, you don't even need 270 speed, but let's say mid-champion, you should be around 270 speed. And then most legend players can at least get one unit to 300 speed. Now again, this is not a hard and fast rule. Some people are very lucky with their speed rolls. Some people are not lucky with their speed rolls, but still have very good bruiser gear. This is just an estimation of the quality of your overall gear. This is the simplest way to do it because obviously I can't look at a million people's accounts and assess their gear. So these are the benchmarks, and literally all it is what's the fastest speed you can get a unit. Generally, it's a reasonably accurate estimate of the overall quality of their gear. Now, in terms of how many people you need geared, obviously you need all those heroes that I mentioned in the previous section to be well geared. They should have your best gear and you shouldn't be scared of picking them because they're all on 78 gear or something. Hopefully all 85s, ideally reforged. But if you can get your whatever that was 13 core units decently built, then you should be ready. And for these tiers that I mentioned, this is around the end of the season because what some people say is, well, I can get to 260 speed, but I can't even get into Masters. While early in the season, even in Masters, you run into a lot of champion legend players because they're not really playing that much. But at the end of the season, all those players will have climbed up, and then the brackets are more realistic. So don't get too discouraged if you're playing early in the RTA season, because yes, it's very possible to be in like silver and match up against people who have every ML5 and godly gear. That won't be as typical near the end of the season. Let's move on. Now let's talk about choosing a playstyle and playstyle overviews. There's more than this, but I'm going to talk about the most general ones. We have concepts like the tanky stall team, an offensive bruiser team, a defensive bruiser team, pure cleave, pseudo cleave, double soul weaver, which I also just called Asian style, and there's a lot of other ones. But let's try and explain them. So tanky stall team, this is kind of outdated. This was more season one, but basically just drafting nothing but knights and soul weavers and trying to wear the other team down. Not really so common in today's meta, but hey, if they change Battle Frenzy, it could come back. Offensive and defensive bruiser are really the same thing. The only difference is offensive bruiser will often use something like a G purge. They're oriented more towards blowing someone up quite early, while defensive bruiser is a little bit more tanky, a little bit more methodical, and honestly safe. Offensive bruiser teams are honestly kind of risky, but a lot more fun, and that's actually my preferred playstyle. Pure cleave are things like, Oxlot, Cerise cleaves. Pseudo cleaves are kind of similar, but they'll usually have a lot of control elements involved. And double soul weaver is exactly what it's called. They usually draft something like Ruel DN with 2 DPS and a forego damage mitigation very often, and just try to DPS race you with big heals. So, what about choosing the playstyle? Well, if you're a new player, the best way is to bruiser. Now I know everyone wants to cleave because there's always like the YDs and lights out there, and like newer players come and watch it, and they're blowing everyone up in the opener. But if you're a new player, you're not ready. Cleave is probably the most gear intensive playstyle to play, especially at the higher levels. Because if you try to cleave, you better be going first. So if you cannot guarantee your turn one, everyone in the game who's faster than you is going to destroy you. You have no chance. Whereas Bruiser is a lot safer. You can get around gear disparities a lot easier if you outdraft the enemy. In a Bruiser v Bruiser matchup, unless you're terribly, terribly outgeared, if you have a better team makeup than them, you still have a shot. Whereas with Cleave, no matter what team you brought, if they outsped you, you basically lose right off the bat. So I would say for all newer players, focus on Bruiser. And honestly, most Legend players play Bruiser as well. Some of them have good enough speed gear where they'll also, play Cleave. They'll do it based on the draft, or some of them are almost exclusively Cleave, although very rarely nowadays. But in general, choose Bruiser. If you can't get 320 speed units, pick Bruiser. Let's move on. All right, so the final quick topic of this introductory section is setting up your core team. It's going to be very similar to what we talked about in the general hero pool requirements. So let's go over these roles. I said you need 3 solid knights, 5 solid DPSs, 2 solid soul weavers, and 3 solid utility heroes. So what do you want? In terms of knights, What's the main role of a knight? Now, obviously, there's a lot of knights in the game and they all have their own unique kits, but I'm gonna generalize this. By knights, I mean damage mitigation options. In RTA, this is one of the most important artifacts in the game. This is one of the most important artifacts in the game because just by being on the field, they greatly reduce the amount of damage your team takes. Especially if you have this gal, she tremendously reduces the damage your team takes. Which means instead of getting one shotted, you survive, you get your turn two, and you can do damage. Newer players look at something like this and they say 20%, that's not a big deal. It's a huge deal. If you're getting one shot and you think 20% won't make a difference, it's because your gear is not good enough. But 20% is absolutely huge. If stacked with Adamant Shield, obviously damn these two stack together. So suddenly you're taking way less damage, your entire team. That's the difference between surviving getting your turn two off and just getting wiped out in the opener. It's very important to have damage mitigation options. DPSs, that role is a lot more straightforward. So the class doesn't matter here. Typically, they're, and it could even be a knight, but typically DPS options are in every role. But basically, you need a way to kill the enemy. If you have no DPS, you'll never win, right? And there's plenty of decent, cheap options. Researcher Carrot is a perfect example, one of the most broken heroes in the game, and she's a free 5-star unit. But basically, what you want is ideally for your 5 DPSs, they'll either be MLs or you'll have them in varying elements. Because what some newer players struggle with is they pick all their DPSs, like they built all of them in the same element. Let's say they love water heroes, and then they start picking a lot of grass units. Suddenly, you don't have any options because water doesn't do well against grass units. So, ideally, you'll have a DPS of every element. And then, obviously, as you expand your kit, you'll have doubles, you'll have triples, just in case it's banned or they steal it. But you need damage options. So, make sure you pick 5 solid DPSs, ideally with different elements, or they're light dart units so they don't suffer from elemental disadvantage. Soul Weavers, you're going to want 2 solid Soul Weavers. Now, in the recent meta, Soul Weavers weren't really as important as they were in the past, but they're still going to be important. So, what you want is basically a healer, something to give your team some sustain. Now, these are strong against opponents that draft teams that don't have a lot of damage. Because if they go super heavy offense, most Soul Weavers in the game, except maybe like Ruel, will struggle to keep up. But if they don't have that much damage and your healer can out heal it, basically you get a couple of free turns, right? So the reason you want 2 is in case the one that you if you only had one that got banned out, you have no healers, right? But budget options are things like a Momo. A Momo's still very good. A Katie's. If you go into high end RTA, then you're probably going to want things like Dien or Maid Chloe or Ruel or Doris. But at least Doris is still F2P as well. But get 2 solid Soul Weavers. And obviously, for all these units I'm talking about, you want your very best gear on them. Now, utility picks are kind of like the X factor, right? Typically, I'm being very general here because they could be control units, they could be speed contesters, but basically, you want some, let's just call them fun units. Something that helps you control the draft, like Fairy Tale Tenebria, Basar. Those are perfect examples because they completely neuter the enemy team if they don't have any response to it. Because if you just pick nothing but Knights, DPSs, and Soul Weavers, you're going to draft something like this and basically try to lock your team down. So you're going to want things like Fairy Tale Tenebria, or if you want to deal with cleavers, maybe you want a speed contest if you have decent speed gear. That would be stuff like Assassin Sid, or you want to control them and make sure they can't CR bump, maybe something like Cerise. The utility picks are the X Factor picks, and we'll get more into the nitty gritty of these roles in a later section. But anyway, that's how you set up your core team. Get each of those units built, put your very best gear on them, emphasize tank if you're playing bruiser, but in general, in your core team, like the cutoff is you really don't want anything in RTA to be below like 180 speed, except for very niche units that have like their own CR bumping mechanics or their counter heroes. even bruisers, like things like Alencia, you're still going to want them at minimum 180 speed, but ideally more around 200. Everything in this game needs some speed. So, anyways, follow those instructions. You have that core team built, and you have that general gear in your head and have some expectations of how high you should be expected to climb, then you can start doing some serious RTA. So that's it for section 1, Introduction to RTA. Let's move on to the fun part. Part 2, Drafting Theory. All right, boys, you guys are now ready for the fun part. Section 2, Drafting Theory. Disclaimer: you may not be able to follow my drafting strategies in the beginning because you simply don't have the heroes or the gear to do so. That's okay. What you should do in these situations is note what hero you're missing, or note what you don't have geared, and start building and filling those holes. In the beginning, this is going to happen a lot. Part of growing in RTA is filling all those holes in your kit to eventually make yourself a far more complete player. Now, this section is very important because drafting is the most important part of an RTA fight. I am a strong believer that the draft is 90% of the match and that the actual battle itself is a formality. Yes, the match itself will have things like player decisions and RNG, but the thing is, in the vast majority of cases, top players will make the correct decision every time. In other words, if you take two top players against each other, they'll be able to tell you with 99% accuracy what their enemy is going to do. So it's almost like an AI is playing anyway, except it's an actually good AI and not the brain dead one that E7 uses in Arena and Guild Wars. So, yeah, drafting is very important because that phase is going to make or break the match. If you cannot draft, you cannot win. Now, I was able to get to Legend RTA with arguably subpar gear because I had a reasonably deep hero pool and I learned to draft well through hundreds and hundreds of losses by getting outplayed. If you learn anything about RTA, it has to be how to draft because if you can't draft, you can't win. That's the end of the story. Drafting is all about information, learning what the other player is trying to do and countering it with your own picks, making sure that you're getting your own strategy through over theirs. If you played other games like Dota or maybe League or something, League sucks, you're probably familiar with the process. In Epic 7, you get one pre-ban each, someone is given first pick, so whatever hero you hate, you get rid of it before the draft phase even starts. And we're going to get into the specifics of each of these phases in the next few topics. The drafting order is then 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 1. Pretty typical. At the end, you get a final ban to remove the hero that is most disruptive to your own strategy, and at that point, the match starts and the better drafter wins. So that's the very simple explanation of drafting. Let's dive deep into the details so that you can learn the ins and outs of how to draft properly. Terminology. Before we proceed further, we got to talk about these things so you know what I'm saying. If you watch my past RTA videos, you've probably heard me say a lot of these things, but you may or may not have implicitly understood what I was talking about. So let's start with numbers. You may have heard before where I say something like X is a solid 5 pick. Essentially, what I mean is it's a solid last pick, but it's a bad early pick. So for simplicity, I just go by 1 to 5 for each player. If I wanted to be really anal about it and very specific, you could say 1 to 10, right? And whoever has first pick got 1, and whoever had last pick is 10. But I think that's a little bit more confusing, so we're just going to go by 1 to 5. So basically, if you have first pick, your pick order is 1, then 2, 3, then 4, 5. If you have second pick, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, then 5. It's fairly straightforward. The number corresponds to the order of the pick. So again, if I say a hero is a decent 5 pick, it means it's a solid final pick. If a hero is a good 1 or 2 pick, that means they're core picks and you could pick them early safely. So yeah, that's basically, let's use a real world example. SSB is a decent 5 pick, but a terrible first pick. So I would say she's a good 5 pick, but a bad 1 pick. Because if you first pick SSB, there's a world of counters that the other person can take right away to neuter you, right? You early pick SSB. Then they pick Rowana, LR Crow. Well, you're immediately kind of screwed, right? Because you have two very hard counters going into your SSB right off the bat. So that's numbers. Counter pick is basically any hero that counters another hero pretty severely. And we're going to break that down into soft counter and hard counter. A soft counter is a hero that performs well against another, but isn't exactly a direct counter. Like, for example, and this could be situational by draft. Let's say that the only DPS you drafted is Caesarado. In this case, something like Ruel may soft counter your team, not because Ruel does anything special that counters Champion Zerato, but simply because Champion Zerato will never do enough damage to single-handedly out DPS a Ruel's heals. That's different from a hard counter. A hard counter is basically where a hero counters another hero so hard that if they get through, basically you lose the game. Greatest example, Rowana versus SSB. If you let Rowana through and you have SSB, you basically can't win. Or Blood Moon Haste into RB. If you have RB and the other guy has Blood Moon Haste, 80+% of the time, you're going to lose. And that's about it for counters. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Speed Contester. Just about any fast unit designed to contest a fast cleaver's turn 1. I mean, what it is in the name, right? Speed Contester. You're trying to contest their speed. So basically any unit with a high base speed that could be built very quickly. You can even argue that speed imprint heroes are speed contesters, even if they're not fast themselves, because if you're drafting things like Fire Shuris or Fire Surin, basically you're just bringing them to make your real speed contester faster. Bait pick. A pick designed to scare the other player into banning it, may or may not even be geared. Easy example, picking a naked acid into a fast cleave to scare them into banning it. Now, once you get into higher tiers, you're going to have so many units built that you're not really going to need to do this that much anymore. I mean, I did it even on the last day, but in your early RTA career, I mean, I did this a lot, and you might have to do this a lot simply because you're not going to have the gear to gear a million units. But you might want to try and control the draft by just scaring them because they don't know what gear you have. They can't look into your account. So if they start trying to cleave you, pick Acid. A lot of times they'll give you the respect and ban it anyway, and you get a free ban. Next term, Force Ban. A unit in a draft that counters you so hard that if you do not ban it, you essentially automatically lose. So we talked about that with hard counters, right? It's basically the same thing as hard counters. Again, perfect example is a Rowana and SSB. I will say that if someone takes SSB and you pick Rowana, they're going to ban your Rowana 99% of the time. And you can play some games with that. But basically a force ban is a ban where you can't let it through because if you do, you lose. And I think that's about it for general terminology. If I think of anything else, I'll put it up on the screen. But I think that's enough for us to move on. So let's get started with the actual draft. Now let's get into the meat of it, the actual drafting phases. Pre-ban phase. What do you pre-ban? This is highly individual. What you should not pre-ban is just a common meta unit. That's a mistake that many amateurs make. They just say, oh, X hero's broken according to everyone, and they pre-ban it every game. No. What you pre-ban is what you individually do not have counters to. No one has a better sense of that than you, because no one else knows your hero pool and what you have geared. Do you lose every time a maid gets through? You ban maid. Have no way to deal with RB? Ban RB. And when you have that hero, when you know that hero you don't have the answer to, that's a hole. So like we said previously, you should start working on solutions for that. You can't beat maid. So start building heroes that counter maid. You can't beat RB. Build your Tomo, build your BMH. Can't do that? Start building tankier teams because those are the best ways to deal with RB. Now at the higher end, pre-banning gets more complicated because some players will keep logs of other players, or some of them it's just easy to remember their names and pre-ban their best geared units. In anything below Legend, this is not realistic because you won't possibly remember all the thousands of random players you may be matched against. But at the high end, you fight the same people over and over, so your pre-bans may be player specific. But That's not really applicable to anything below legend, so we won't talk too much about that until section 4. Another thing that plays a critical role in your pre-ban is whether or not you have first pick, because you find this out before you even have to pre-ban, right? Let's say every time you run into an enemy carrot, you lose. But carrot's an F2P unit that everyone should have built, including you, and is a reasonable 1 pick. So if you have first pick and you're scared of carrot, don't pre-ban it, just take it. Carrot was quite a common first pick, even in Legend. And if you have second pick and you know you just can't beat carrot teams, that's where you should pre-ban it. Another important thing to note about the pre-ban phase, going beyond just what do you pre-ban, is again, RT is about information, right? You need to take note of your opponent's pre-ban. What is that guy telling you? Sometimes it's something random and it doesn't really tell you all that much, but other times it's very informative. The best example, Fallen Cecilia. 99% of people who pre-ban Fallen Cecilia are cleavers, because bruiser players don't really care about FCC. They're used to it. It's not really that big a deal. She doesn't do that much damage if she's built very tanky. I mean, even a DPS Fallen Cecilia doesn't really hit that hard. So conversely, someone who bans something like Cerise or Flitica, what are they telling you? It's telling you that they're likely very weak against cleave and is trying to take away some core cleave units right off the bat. So if you have an extensive cleave arsenal and they pre-ban Cerise, you can almost try to cleave them anyway because they're basically telling you they can't deal with cleave well, so double down on it. And again, let's do another example. Let's say someone bans BMH. What are they telling you? There's no reason to ban BMH unless you're trying to pick revive heroes. So if they pre-ban BMH, what do you right away know you're going to run into? Either RB or Maid. So pay attention to the pre-bans, and if it indicates a weakness, try to exploit it right off the bat. And try to respond to it right off the bat. Going back to that FCC example, if they pre-ban FCC, you know they're probably trying to cleave, so don't pick units that suck against cleaves, like slow squishy bruisers. Other than that, pre-banning is pretty simple and straightforward. Just make sure that you factor in your draft order and your ability to deal with certain units, and that's all there is to it. It's the easiest phase. Let's move on. Alright, let's get into the meat of it, the main drafting phase. So this is going to be the most important part of this video probably, because a lot of amateur players really don't know how to do this, but the premise is actually very simple. So again, following that numbering strategy, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on each side. First, we're going to start in generalities, and then we'll talk about adjustments based on whether you have first pick or second pick. So in the general form, your 1-2 picks, you want them to be core picks, or you can call them neutral picks, whatever you want. But the basic idea is you want your 1-2 picks to be heroes that are solid into any draft and don't really have any viable hard counters. They might have soft counters, that's fine, but no hard counters. More often than not, these core picks will be something like knights or neutral utility picks. Let's talk about some common examples. So, common core picks, first picks will be things like FCC or Blue Crow, or neutral DPSs might be something like Carrot, only because she's so damn busted that she actually works against everything, like both Cleave, Bruiser, whatever. She's kind of unique in that way. Generally, you don't early pick DPS like that. Core utility picks might be something like GP, General Purges, because he's effective against both bruisers and cleavers. But the idea here is you want to pick core units first, because at this point, unless it's someone you played multiple times, you don't really have an idea of what the other guy is trying to do yet. So you don't want to pick a niche hero that is completely useless against cleave with first pick, because then if they end up being cleavers, you're automatically 1 unit down. So basically, your first 2 picks should almost always be something that works decently well against anything. Core/neutral picks. Sometimes even your 3-4 will be 4 neutral picks depending on how the enemy drafted. The sole exception is if you have second pick and they telegraph a playstyle right away, or you know the player very well. For example, let's say they have first pick, pre-ban FCC, and pick Cerise. Then maybe you can start kind of leaning towards a little bit more counter, but you should still not go too specialized anti-cleave right away because it's early enough where they can still transition to a completely different play style. So you still want to stay kind of on the safer neutral side. Now, what you don't want to do, and a lot of new players do this because they have like specific heroes that they love because they have their best gear, is early pick a unit with a hard counter. Because then, right off the bat, you're potentially going to be placed into a force ban situation, which means the other guy controls the entire draft from that point forward because he can safely read your ban right off the bat. Let's take an example here. Let's say you first pick SSB like a bozo. It goes to him. He first picks Rowana. From this point, essentially, if he's committing to letting SSB through, he can draft the next 4 units with impunity because he can safely assume you have to ban Rowana. Now, of course, you can try to draft things to kind of counter Rowana, but it's not really viable. Like, basically, you'd have to somehow stop the CR push and all the heals and try and land unbuffable on everyone at the same time. It's going to be hard. And he still has 4 picks left to deal with that as well. And if he takes another SSB counter, like, LR Crow or something like that, you're in deep, deep trouble. So basically, keep your early 1-2 picks agnostic, never give them too much information, and don't pick things with hard counters early. Now let's talk about your 3-4 picks. Generally, these are either more core/neutral picks or counter picks. Depends on what the other player is doing. If they're picking pretty core neutral picks on their own, you can also do the same, and this kind of just ends up being like bruiser versus bruiser battles. But typically, 3-4 is where you start picking up your counters and your DPSs. There are a few exceptions, like double Soul Weaver players will very often do things like 1-2 pick DPSs, but in most cases, this is where the DPSs start getting picked up. So here's how you decide. If they picked incredibly neutral heroes for their 1-2 without super hard counters, then continue to draft normal. If they drafted something that has obvious counters, then draft a counter. Like, let's say you had first pick, you picked whatever, and then they 1-2 picked something like, I don't know, Blue Crow and S10A. So you still kind of want to stay neutral, right? But you know there's an S10A on the board, but this is where you start deciding what your DPSs are. And this is telling you you probably want to start drafting DPSs with some reach. So maybe a Landy, maybe a Fire Charlotte. Who knows? Definitely not SSB this early, but basically you want to pick stuff that can get to that S10A because it's very likely that something else is going to come up later that's a more viable ban than the S10A. So there's a very good chance you have to let the S10A through. So you want to start drafting assuming that what they 1-2 picked is going to get through. You don't want to start trying to counter it too hard and then end up in a situation where they pick a force ban in the 5 slot and then your team makes absolutely no sense. So 3-4, start transitioning to counter picks to their enemy units or stay neutral, whatever, it just depends on how they drafted. Now your last pick. Ideally, in a perfect situation where you outdrafted the crap out of him, this is where you just pick a force ban unit. Now, realistically, against good players, this isn't always possible. You know you outdrafted the other guy if you can safely know your first 4 picks are going to get through and they have to ban your 5 pick, and you also know that you can just ban their 5 pick. If you're ever in that situation, it means you outdrafted them. But against top players, it's not always possible. Or sometimes there is a force ban hero available, but you don't have him built, so it's irrelevant. You can't pick it. So let's look at an example here. All right, let's look at a real world example of how this plays out. This is a real match from the last day of Skyward season. So here I first pick General Purges. Again, it's a core neutral utility pick, works against both bruisers and anti-cleave, just an annoying hero to deal with overall. And it goes to him. And he's going to 1-2 pick core contested neutral picks as well. Carrot and Blue Crow. They're also, I mean, Blue Crow doesn't work too well against Cleave, but I picked G Purge, so he's probably not too worried about that. So now he has two core units that work against a wide variety of comps. Also, he picks the Blue Prowl because it's a natural counter to Carrot, so he takes it to give himself damage mitigation, also protect himself against it. I take another core pick, FCC, and I also take RB, which is not the smartest pick to be honest, but all of you who have followed me for a while know I'm a filthy RB lover. So that's a generally not a great pick in this situation, because if he has Blood Moon Haste, I'm going to walk into it. Although it's possible that I knew he didn't have Blood Moon Haste at the time. Now here, see look, he could pick a hard counter unit, but he took a neutral pick, right? Dien is pretty neutral, good against a lot of things with no real huge counters other than like unbuffable. And he takes LQC. Now LQC, he's starting to adjust his draft to mine because I have FCC and RB on the board, both dark units. LQC is very strong against both of them. And I start adjusting my draft to him as well. And this is where the counters start coming out. Kisei is a pretty decent counter to Carrot because she does a lot of damage to her and can reset Carrot's S3. Does decently well against LQC as well, can also reset that if I decide to ban Carrot. And with the stealth, Dien and Crow can't really get to Kisei. So Kisei's a very strong pick here. And now I need one more counter to his draft. Looks like I'm kind of thinking about it here. And I opt to go with Inferno Kawazu. Inferno Kawazu is good here because he has a full strip, right? Because he's telling me that he wants to put a lot of buffs up with the DN, and Kawazu can just strip all of them and one-shot one of his units. Now, my main goal here is to wipe out that LQC, right? So very good counter pick against the LQC. Not that great of a counter against the other units, but here, now look at the situation. Look how quickly I ban this ACID because it's a force ban situation for me here. So he drafted that hero well there because if the ACID gets through, what's my problem? Kisei is a very squishy hero. Inferno Kawazu would probably survive it, but still not a super tanky hero. So basically, if the ACID gets through and he doesn't intend to ban my Kisei, I automatically lose this fight, right? So I'm basically force banning. I'm forced to ban this ACID here. Now, in his shoes, he has a lot more options of what he wants to draft. So, in my opinion, he kind of outdrafted me here. Because I had to force ban his 5 pick, but he had a litany of possible bans here. But he does opt to go with the Kisei anyway. So honestly, this was a good move on his part because he banned out the thing that ACID counters because he knew I was going to ban the ACID because I had no choice. So this was a very smart pick on his part. He played it perfectly. He got Kisei off the board, got rid of that hard counter to Carrot. But overall, this draft still worked out fine because my Inferno Kawazu got through, which basically meant this LQC was dead in the water. Now, I think I do end up winning this match. If you guys want to see the rest of it, you can see my RTA climb video on the last day to see how it actually played out. But I think it was just an interesting draft to look at, and it kind of showed all the fundamentals of how that drafting phase works. Let's move on. All right, so we talked about the general drafting guidelines, right? Which is essentially draft safe early, move on to counters. But what about altering that strategy based on whether or not you have first pick or second pick? And this is very important actually because drafting is immensely impacted by whether or not you have first or second pick. I personally prefer having first pick. Some players prefer having second pick. Obviously, they both have their advantages and disadvantages. So let's get into that right now. So, what's the main advantages of first pick? So, in my opinion, these are the two. Number one, you have the obvious first chance to take a heavily contested hero, right? You have first pick. So, if you really like a certain hero, that's very meta and a common first pick like Carrot, Maid, FCC, G Purge, whatever, you have a first go at it. And this is particularly good for players who have a limited hero pool and a favored playstyle. Those kind of players will generally do better when they get first pick. The other big advantage that I like is you have the last round of the double draft. So basically, you have the last turn where you get to pick two heroes. That means that you see four of their heroes, and if they gave you the opportunity, you can pick two heroes that heavily counter one of their picks, and at least one of them have to get through. The caveat to this is your draft has to be decent enough where you're basically going to auto ban whatever they pick last. So this works great in that situation. This is why I prefer having first pick. A lot of times, my draft is to the point where I basically say, I don't care what they pick last, whatever it is, it's being banned. Now, what's the second pick advantage? Number one, obviously, you start off with more information because the other guy had to pick first. The first picker, assuming that they're strangers, has no idea what their opponent's drafting style is outside of any information they might have given him in the pre ban. The second player, however, you do get some information off that first pick, like if they pick G Purge, obviously a G Purge Bruiser player. If they pick Cerise, most probably a cleaver, not definitely, but probably a cleaver. So you do have some information, which means you start having the ability to draft counters a little bit more early than that first picker. The second main advantage is you get to pick the hero last. So this simplifies drafting a force ban, right? Because as the first picker, um, basically you're always open to a counter, right, on that last pick because the second pick player sees everything on the board. They see all five heroes. So there's no more surprises coming at that point, right? So if you have the final pick and you have a hero in your kit that heavily counters the first picker's entire team, then no matter what it is, the first picker has to ban it, right? So basically, it makes it much easier to draft a force ban in this situation if you have the second pick. So, does this really change the drafting strategy we discussed earlier? Not really. In general, it's still fundamentally the same. You draft safe early and you start drafting counters as the draft kind of develops. The main difference here is that as the second picker, you have a little bit more flexibility in drafting counters early. However, be wary of this. You don't want to counter too hard too early. In other words, you don't want to make too many assumptions early. Let's think of a quick example here and then we'll move on. So let's take this example. First picker, pre-bans FCC, first pick Cerise. You immediately think, oh, this dude's a cleaver, which is honestly a pretty reasonable assumption. But how can you react to this too hard in the wrong way and ignore the rule to draft core neutral early? So let's say because he picks Cerise, you say, this dude's a cleaver, and you pick Acid Politis. Both perfectly reasonable anti-cleave heroes, right? But whoops, now that first picker drafts Blue Crow and G Purge. Now you're in a weird spot, right? Because your first two picks are basically dead weight against a bruiser draft. And he's not going cleave at all anymore. Because you responded too hard to a supposed cleave, the other player was smart and said, okay, I'm just going to switch my playstyle entirely because you picked two dedicated anti-cleave units, and now I'm going to let them both through. So you can try to respond to that by transitioning to your own weird cleave, but again, you have kind of a wonky draft now, so it's probably going to be hard. So basically, the rule here is follow the rules we discussed in the previous section, play it safe early, transition to counters, but as the second pick, you can counter a little bit earlier because you have more information, but just don't try and counter too hard and get into one of those bad situations where they transition. So, anyways, I think that's about it for this section. There's also other situations, mostly around the 5 pick and the 4-5 pick for the first picker, but I'll let you learn those on your own. Let's move on. Now, before we wrap this main draft section up, inevitably people are going to ask about exceptions. Do you always have to follow these rules? And the answer is Of course not. There are players who don't follow these rules who are top players. Like I said, double Soul Weaver players very often will draft their DPS first and then draft their Soul Weavers and Knights later. Cleavers may not really follow these rules at all, especially if they have overwhelmingly good gear. They'll just bully you with gear diff. And basically, those kind of players might end up just drafting 3 DPS right off the bat and going into their utility later. There are always exceptions, but what's definitely true is before you start branching off into experimenting and trying those things, you have to understand the fundamentals. And these are the fundamentals of how to draft. If once you're really good, you want to try other things, feel free to. And if it's super dominant, maybe that style will become the new meta. But this is the most important way to start learning because this will get your win rate up. You'll start understanding the flow of the draft. And then once you've mastered this, you can move on to different strategies, different mind games. But if any of these concepts were new to you, you should try drafting in this way for at least a few weeks until you have a mastery of it, and then you could try other things that may be more suited to a fun play style for you. So, anyways, with that, let's move on. All right, now let's talk about the ban phase. The ban phase is so crucial. Many games will be decided right here. I mean, I'm a big fan of poker, and a lot of the concepts translate over to E7 drafts. Essentially, there is some RNG involved here because both of you have the ability to play games and bluff. And in many cases, whoever is the better bluffer wins. But no one's smart enough to be right all the time. And it's not like poker, there's no reads or tells other than if you've played the guy a million times and you just know his style. But usually you'll be playing complete strangers and you have no idea what their mindset is like. So there's some RNG in it. Now let's talk about easy ban situations. If you pick units and they picked super hard counters that are going to neuter you if they get through, like let's say you picked a bunch of speed units and they last pick ace it or something, 99% of the time the correct play is just to ban the hard counter. Those are easy ban situations. Unless you got outdrafted so bad that even removing the hard counter, your chances are still non existent. In that case, you may just try to throw a Hail Mary and do something like ban damage mitigation and just go all in. But in most cases, just ban the hard counter, and ideally, you're not in that kind of situation or some no win situation right from the draft. But let's talk about trickier ban situations where mind games are involved. I found this perfect one from my final legend push. Let's analyze this draft. Now, again, this is an example of a match that was decided during the ban phase. I could have easily lost this match depending on how the draft went. This is entirely decided in the draft. Let's look at this. I have G Purge, Crow, Landy, Basar, Caesarado. He has FCC S10A, Carrot, Ruel, and Champ Z on the board. So what's the problem here? The Champ Z counters everything on his team pretty much except S10A, right? So if Champ Z gets through and S10A is banned, then he basically loses because FCC will provoke him, get countered. Carrot will decrease speed or burn him, get countered. Ruel won't trigger a counter, but she does no damage. Troublemaker won't trigger a counter, but he does no damage. So they're kind of irrelevant unless it goes to like Battle Frenzy 1000. So basically, in his eyes, Champ Z is kind of a forced ban, right? But what's the other problem here? If I ban the carrot, then Landy is pretty damn strong against his team, right? Landy does a very good job of executing S10As because she just spams so many AoEs. So if the S10A does get through and he bans the Champ Z, now he has to deal with an attack buffed Landy just turreting into the S10A. So in this situation, it's all mind games, right? Because with this last pick, I was trying to tell him, hey, I'm going to ban the S10A, and I want you to be soloed by Champ Z. And, it's just a mind game here. It's what are they actually trying to do? And if you watch here, I actually end up banning the carrot, predicting that he's gonna ban the Champ Z. But what if he read my mind there and banned Landy instead? Now I have my only DPS as a Champ Z against an S10A that's just gonna wait and then soul burn repeatedly into my Champ Z. And obviously you can't counter S10A. And at that point, I would automatically lose because my solo Champ Z would not have had enough damage to bust through two Knights Ruel and an S10A. So this is a perfect example of a match completely decided in the ban phase, and this is going to be a lot of matches, guys. So with your bans, if it's a very easy one like the one I described with Acid, you just ban the hard counter. But with the higher level ones where it kind of gets into mind games, you're just going to need the experience. You're just going to have to kind of know your best case scenario. And then in many cases, you're almost going to have to flip a coin and go with your gut because again, I didn't know what Jinx was going to do here. I had a hunch and I went with it and it worked out for me in this match. But I've had plenty of matches where it didn't work out for me, where I completely mucked up the ban because I predicted incorrectly, and right from the ban phase, I knew I was probably going to lose. It is what it is. You're just going to get better at it the more you play. So that's all we have to talk about for bans. Let's move on to the next topic. Now let's talk about controlling the flow of the draft. Another thing you'll have to learn to be a top drafter is how to do this. Remember, the same way that you're responding to your opponent's draft, they are also responding to your draft. This has important implications. We just talked about the ban phase, but what I kind of want you to get in your head is that in reality, every single pick is also a pseudo ban phase. You can control what's likely to get on the board and what's not through your own picks. It's just not the final ban phase. Every single pick you make is controlling what they're likely to pick. So there's infinite scenarios here, but let's try an easy example that I used a lot last season. Let's say for whatever reason that you have poor answers to F10A. Basically, every time Fairy Tale gets through, you lose. So how do you discourage an F10A pick? Pick FCC. This is something I did a lot last season. Just first pick FCC because she's pretty neutral, pretty solid against Cleave, although Opsig kind of ruined that, but solid against Cleave, perfectly fine in a bruiser draft because F10A can't really land her stuff if you have barrier and immunity. So simply by being on the board, FCC is blocking the F10A pick. Now, can the other guy pick F10A anyway? Sure, of course he can. But if he does, he is taking a major risk. Because in this situation, he's basically put himself willingly into a force ban situation and giving you that information. Otherwise, he's committing to losing his turn one because F10 is also kind of a speed contest unit depending on how they built her. So if you first pick FCC and they take their first pick on F10A, right away they're telling you what they're banning de facto, right? Now, of course, he doesn't have to ban FCC, but if he doesn't, you can basically just ignore the F10A, right? So you can draft assuming now that your FCC is most likely going to be banned out and start stacking counters on him until he basically can't win. Heck, you can also just ban the F10A anyway, knowing he's going to ban FCC. This is where the mind games come in, because a lot of times, another common example is SSB Rowana. You'll pick Rowana to counter the other SSB, and you know they have to ban the Rowana, so you'll ban the SSB anyway. So this is kind of just mind games. You'll just learn that with experience. But the basic premise here is this. You need to identify the holes in your game and understand that in a way you can patch those holes with your drafting strategies until you fill out those weaknesses. Struggle with Carrot? Maybe start early picking Blue Crowd because he's pretty neutral and may deter some players from picking Carrot, although not always because Carrot is so busted they might pick her anyway. Maybe you really hate dealing with landy teams. Maybe build out some fire units and draft them early. Like, Fire Charlotte is pretty good into a lot of drafts. Maybe you three pick her if Landy still isn't on the board, and they're unlikely to pick Landy after that because if they do, they're basically committing to having to ban your Fire Charlotte or losing, and they might not want to give you that information that early. Now, they might five pick Landy, but then again, then they're telling you they're going to ban the Fire Charlotte. So, I mean, again, there's far too many situations to go into every single one, but all you have to take away from here is this. Your pick phase is not just you picking your heroes or countering the enemy's heroes, it's also you blocking picks. It's a giant web. So keep that in mind, and the best way to get good at this is just keep playing until these situations become natural to you. Let's continue. All right, so now that we've talked about the drafting phase, let's close out section 2 by talking about common, fatal mistakes. Mistakes that amateur RTAs make all the time that you need to make sure you don't do. I mean, in the beginning, you're going to make a lot of mistakes, but try and make sure you don't make these ones. So let's start off with a very common one drafting one DPS. Almost always a terrible, terrible idea. You pick one DPS against any decent player, see you later, DPS. It's going to get banned, and 90% of the time you will lose. Usually, this happens with amateur drafters because they're so concerned with spamming counters to the enemy picks that when they're done, they look at their roster and they have nothing but counters and no damage. For example, like if the other guy had SSB and like Maid, they would just pick like BMH and Rowana and just goes on and on. Like maybe they take Basar too, and then that player takes Lilius and like Yafine or something, and just end up having no damage. And that ends up being a problem because if you don't have any DPS, you can't kill anything. And with the way Battle Frenzy currently works, they won't die either, and eventually you'll just get nuked out. So never draft only one DPS unless you have a very, very good reason to. Next common mistake drafting easily countered units early. Like, for example, let's say they picked SSB first. Great, what's the other player going to do? Immediately pick Rowana, and you're in a force ban situation right off the bat, and the other player controls the draft from the very first pick. This is why you always pick core units first, because you don't have enough information yet. And then as you have your core safe units that kind of work against everything, you can gather more information throughout the draft and continue to draft accordingly. I was actually guilty of this quite often because I love RB so much and run into BMH all the time because the thought of someone else taking my delicious RB was unacceptable to me. That doesn't mean you should make this mistake. Make sure your 1, 2, 3 picks are core picks without force ban style counters. Next common mistake going way too many DPS. Unless you're cleaving or very badly outgear your opponents, it makes no sense to go maximum 3 DPS in 99% of situations. Because if you pick like 4 DPS and like a random initiator, you're just gonna ban the initiator and your supporting units and just poop on you. So make sure you don't go way too many DPS for no reason at all. You usually want at least one kind of damage mitigation, one kind of utility pick or a control pick. Just spamming DPS is very rarely the right answer. Next common mistake, doubling up on identical roles. This is most common with people who run Basar. Let's say you really want to land on Buffable on your opponent and you have Basar on the board, but you think they're going to ban it. So you also take Briarwitch. So now you have Basar Briarwitch. Now, I don't want to say this is always a bad play. Sometimes, depending on how the draft goes, it actually might be smart. But in general, if you double up on a role and the other player knows they can't get rid of them both, what's a smart player going to do? They're going to let them both through. They're going to get unbuffable anyway, so what's the point of banning either one? They're playing the same role, right? The most common consequence of doubling up on identical roles is that you don't draft enough DPS and they just stall through your damage by drafting more tank. So if you decide to do this, generally you have to 4 or 5 pick it and commit to banning whatever their last pick is. Because the other risk here is if you double up on a role, they'll double up on the counters and then not ban either of yours because they know at least one of their counters is going to get through. So it's very risky. And again, there are situations where this makes sense to do, But just be wary of it because this is very often linked to fatal mistake number one, which is drafting one DPS. And finally, um, picking a unit early that can be countered by 4 or 5 picks. Um, for example, let's say you pick Tomo when the other guy has a 4 or 5 pick available, and you leave the last 2 slots open for the enemy for speed DPS. Let's imagine this draft. Let's say you picked Tomo with your 4 pick, and now it goes to the enemy for their 4 or 5 pick. What if they pick 2 speed? Let's say they take Acid A. coli. Um, then you're screwed, right? Because either of them can one-shot Tomo in the opener, and it doesn't matter what you pick last because in this situation, they're almost 100% going to ban whatever you pick last, no matter what. So basically, you're down 1 unit right from the start, right? So be very careful about giving the enemy 4 or 5 picks that can very easily counter your last pick. These are the kind of things you'll have to pay close attention to if you don't want to lose matches before they even start. So, those are some of the most common fatal mistakes. I'm sure there are more, but I think that's a good starting point. Best way to learn more fatal mistakes is to make them and learn from them. And that wraps up the drafting part of this. Now we're going to move on to the next section. So, I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let's move on. All right, boys. We covered a lot of material here, so let's go into some key takeaways. I know we covered a lot, so if you don't retain any of it, just retain these 3 things for you newer players out there. Number one, start your drafts with safe picks. Don't risk running into a bunch of hard counters early, because if you do, what's going to happen is there's going to be too many hard counters on the board, and you're not going to be able to recover from that draft because one of them will have to get through. You only have one ban. Your first 2 picks should always be very safe, very versatile. Your next 2 picks, you can pick counters, or you can continue drafting safe if you don't have those counters built. And your last pick, it's not always possible, but you should always try to make it a force ban, something that counters their draft so heavily that they have to ban it. And you should be comfortable playing with your first 4 picks. Number two, learn where you're weak because you want to improve, right? If you're not a legend player, or actually, if you're not the best player in the world, you always have room for improvement. And honestly, even the best player in the world has room for improvement. The hero you always pre-ban, best place to start because that means you recognize that you can't beat that hero. Figure out why. Is it because you don't have any of the counters built? Do you just not understand how that heroes work? That's where you want to look first to find the holes in your kit. What heroes do you always lose to? And remember, Epic 7 has that awesome feature where you can look at like your last 15 battles and see the battle log. You could see the draft order, the bans, analyze it. If you lose a match, the first thing you should do is go into that battle log, look at it, and say, what could I have done better? And a lot of times, you're going to learn something from that. And finally, are you repeatedly making one of the fatal mistakes that I outlined? There's a lot of other fatal mistakes out there, but the point is, those are the easiest ones. If you're making those mistakes often, first you have to recognize it and then fix it. And goes back to that battle log. Look at your last 10 matches, look at those battle logs. Did you make any of those fatal mistakes? Remember, making mistakes is okay as long as you learn from them and get better at preventing them. And even at the top, you're going to make some of these mistakes every once in a while. That's okay. Just recognize it, learn from it, and move on. So now let's move on to section 3. I hope this part's been helpful for you guys. All right, so now that we've wrapped up drafting strategy, now we're going to talk about expected value, win conditions, and then we're going to go into some general tips. So here, before we just talked about the draft, right? And I said that the draft is 80% of the match. In this section, we're going to talk about your actual in-match play. When you're actually in the match and the draft is already decided, what are some things you can do to actually perform better in the actual match? Now, like I said before, at the high levels, this is just a formality. Most high level players will make the correct choice 99% of the time. But if you're in like Challenger or below, there's a high chance you're making a lot of basic common mistakes, like using the wrong skills, using S3s when you shouldn't be. So that's what we're going to cover in this section. And at the end, we're just going to go into some general tips on things you should be doing to get better at RTA, like what kind of gear should you build, what kind of heroes should you build, stuff like that. So let's get started. Next topic, what is EV, or expected value? For poker players out there, you'll know this term already. Definition is a predicted value of a variable calculated as a sum of all possible values each multiplied by the probability of its occurrence. But the easier explanation is, what is the chance of this play getting you a win? Advanced players know that E7 is a game of probabilities. With so many RNG mechanics and the reality of absolute resistance, RNG is something that will always play a role in this game. Don't be one of those noobs who blames RNG for every loss and pats themselves on the back for having so much talent when they win from RNG. Instead, you need to learn to make the highest EV play every time. I join and watch a lot of mock lobbies, especially when I'm doing something else like playing Among Us or working or something. And the difference between how top players play and how lower level, even mid champion players play, is very, very different. Very low level players are almost like AIs. They just want to dump their S3s as soon as they're up and kill the lowest HP unit all the time. High level players play very differently. They understand win conditions, and sometimes going for the S1 and trying to get that dual attack, even though it's a very low percentage play, is still a better play than using an S3. Why did we discuss that? Because the next section is making the highest EV play. Making the highest EV play. The simple answer to this is just think. Don't think about just the current turn, think about the next turns. Think about top chess players. They're not looking at just the current move, they're looking 3, 4, 5, 20 moves ahead, predicting everything that happens, and that's why they become pros or grandmasters, whatever you call them. Here are some basics to making high EV plays. Number one, understand hero kits. Now, there are a lot of heroes in this game, but you don't have to know all of them. The reality is 90% of them are never ever used in top RTA. So you don't have to know every single hero, but you should very well understand the 25 to 50 heroes that are commonly drafted in the current meta. Because if you don't even know what the heroes do, how are you going to come up with counters to it? So if you find yourself in a lot of situations where you run into a hero and you're like, ugh, I didn't know they could do that, well, then you're not ready. Go to the hero page, look at their skills, and next time you'll know. Number two, look at where heroes are on the CR bar, and also you're going to need to have a sense of relative speeds. Because someone can be in front of someone on the CR bar, but they're slower and can get cut, right? So don't just look at the CR bar, you're more trying to figure out who's going to take the next turn. And this is going to help you make a lot of decisions, right? For example, let's say someone on the other team has very low HP and your highest damage unit, it's his current turn. Do you need to hit that low HP unit with your high DPS unit when you have a low DPS unit coming right after that could finish that low HP unit off? Isn't it a waste to waste your heavy hitting attack that's going to have few thousand damage worth of overkill onto hero that's going to die to a Soul Weaver's S1 anyway? These are the kind of things you have to be thinking about. Number three, keep an eye on cooldowns. You can click this button here to open up the cooldowns of every single unit on the board. Use it often. A lot of units in this game are dependent on their skills and do next to nothing when their skills are on cooldown. Like, for example, do you really have to care about Fairy Tale Tenebria's turn after she used her S3? Is it scary? Not really. It's like going to do 0 damage and maybe add a few poisons. It's not a big deal. And this can really help with target prioritization. Like if they have their big skills on cooldown, a lot of times you can just ignore them and focus on the more immediate threats. And number four, keep an eye on your souls. Having souls and not having souls will have a huge impact on the number of plays available to you. let's think of an example. So Spectre Tenebria, if she has souls, she can potentially do fun things like block RB revives, right? You can S1 to kill him, and then S3 right after to either kill him outright or stun him. And this play is actually used very often in the top meta. But if you don't have souls, that's not a play, right? And if killing him is going to get you killed and you can't follow up with the S3, maybe hitting him on that turn is not the right option. But so, I mean, these are all the things you kind of have to think about. So, when making the highest EV play, I think those are the most important things. Understand every hero's kit, look at who's going to take the next turn, keep an eye on the cooldowns, and keep an eye on your souls. There's a lot more to it than that, but again, there's just so many situations. I tried to dumb it down to the easiest four, but let's go into some more complicated examples and let's look at actual matches now. All right, so let's watch this real world example here. I'm going to start a little early. Take careful note of the CR bar to kind of give you a sense of the mechanics you have to understand to really be a great RTA player. So here, it's Landy's turn, and he rips the Soul Burn, and he hits my whole team, chunks them for pretty good damage. We're going to pause here. Now look, basically Kisei FCC and S10A are stacked on top of each other, and it's Landy's turn. So I'm going to give you a second here, and you tell me what you would do in this situation. You have full fighting spirit with Landy, and you have 2 souls or 20 souls, however you count it. Basically, he can soul burn again. Take a second to think about it. Did you decide? All right, let's think about all the factors that go into this decision. He can soul burn S3 here, right? What's the problem? If you count the buffs here, Arby is going to revive and have 0 buffs, right? So we have 8 buffs on my team. What does that mean? If he soul burns, he cannot S3 again. He will have to S1. Is a Landy S1 going to kill Arbiter Vildred in one shot? No, not unless it triggers a dual attack, which is a very low percentage play. If he does this, what is the risk? Well, there's two actually, right? The obvious risk is he can't kill the RB, RB gabs, and wipes out his entire team. What is the second risk? If you go back and watch that CR bar, Kisei was very close to the FCC and S10A. So she can theoretically, very possibly cut them. I don't know exactly if she would have, but it's pretty close, right? Landy pushes her team by 15%. G Purge with the exclusive equipment pushes his team by 18%. So when it got pushed all the way up to the top, Kisei probably closed the gap a little bit. A second hit might actually make her cut. And then an RB S3 into a Kisei S2 is definitely going to wipe out his entire team. So what's the smarter play here? What does he end up doing? Well, he just S1s the Crow. Why? Same reason for RB. He can't hit Kisei. He doesn't want to hit RB because he might accidentally kill him. If he hits G Purge, it's going to make Kisei cut his team. So he hits Crow, not because he thinks he can kill Crow with a Landy S1, because it's the only target that doesn't have some kind of negative drawback to it right away. Because what's he trying to do? He wants to bring S10A's turn up. Because what can S10A do? Save the souls for S10A, and she can Soulburn Arbiter Vildred, deny that revive Gab, and deny that turn by stunning him. He could potentially resist, but that's only 15%. And if he does that, FCC can also put up Skill Nullifier and give his team added protection and give Carrot a chance to get up to the top. So he made the right play here, but a lot of amateur players wouldn't have. They would have seen, oh, full fighting spirit, Landy S3, rip it, rip it. But those people would have lost. Like, these kind of plays matter. And for top players, this is very trivial and obvious. But at the lower levels, I see these kind of mistakes all the time, like every match where it's like, why did you attack that person? Why did you rip that S3? You need to think about everyone's kits and actually know the numbers and put odds to them in your head. Like, you don't need to be a mathematician and put exact numbers, but you should have a general sense of what the highest EV play is. And of course, he made the right one, and he ended up taking the match for that reason. Let's look at another one. All right, for the sake of time, let's just look at a very easy one. This should be obvious to hopefully 90% of you. It's LR Crow's turn. This is the situation. Crow's going to come up, and then Carrot, S10A, and LQC are right behind him. What would you do? Take 5 seconds to think about it. All right, well, hopefully that was an easy one. You don't S3 here, right? Why? S10A, LQC are slept. So if you S3, what happens? You wake them up, and suddenly I get opened on by three very hard hitting DPS. If I don't S3, I can rotate back around and deny LQC and S10A their first turns, which is great because my team's faster than them. I'm going to cut them anyway, right? Yes, this leaves kind of Carrot available on the board, but can Carrot realistically kill anyone on my team without attack buff in the opener? No. So by herself, she's not a threat. So hopefully that was super easy for you guys, but it kind of puts these concepts together. Think about the CR bar. Think about the enemy's debuff status. Think about their kits. Like, what can they do to react to certain abilities that you have, whether it be a passive or just a active response. You have to think about all these things to make the highest EV play. Don't just play like the AI and mash whatever heaviest damage ability you have. It doesn't make any sense to do that. And this will become second nature to you as you progress. But in the beginning, be very mindful about every decision. And if you can, you should record your matches. If you're really serious about getting good in RTA, record your matches, pause, and just look at it and try and see all the misplays that you made. And if you actively think about it, you're going to have a much better time fixing it. Another very minor tip for RTA is keep in mind you can change your imprints after the ban phase using these buttons. So let's say here, made Chloe as a self-effect resist imprint, but it makes no sense to use it because they don't have any serious debuffer, so you could change it to a team imprint. So some of you guys might not know this, you can change the imprints for any hero you want to adjust to each team. So that's just a quick one in case you didn't know. All right, now let's talk about win conditions. What is a win condition? Well, typically in a lot of drafts, there's one main threat on the other team, and if you take it out, you automatically win. And we'll show you an example later. But basically, at the start of every single match, you should implicitly know what your win condition is. The complicated part about this is your win condition might actually change throughout the match depending on, what heroes get debuffed or defense broken or whatever. Sometimes it's right to switch target, but let's keep it simple for now. So at the beginning of every match, you should ask yourself two questions. Number one, what is the highest priority threat? And number two, what does the enemy consider to be his highest priority threat? So let's talk about number one. Generally, this is one of their DPSs, whichever is going to output the most damage if they're left untouched. Particularly if you're both playing teams where you don't have any healing or revive. 99% of the time, you're going to want to go on one of their DPSs for two reasons. Number one, they're usually the squishiest units on the board because their subs are allocated to offensive stats. And number two, killing them de facto increases your survivability, right? Because you take them off the board. But it's not always the DPS. Most often, like an example of this might come up if you drafted a relatively low DPS team, and let's say the other team has a Soul Weaver. A great example is Ruel. If you drafted very little damage and you let Ruel through, your win condition is you have to figure out a way to kill the Ruel. Otherwise, she'll just keep healing and make it impossible for your low DPS team to kill anything. So oftentimes the best strategy against something like this is to stall it out, split damage onto their squishier units until she's forced to heal, and then wait until Battle Frenzy gives you an opening to actually land a kill on her. Now let's talk about a common mistake, because a lot of times people misidentify what the highest priority threat is. Let's take this draft, for example. F10A is going to be pretty damn toxic here, right? Is she the highest priority threat? Well, no, not really. At least not from the standpoint of what you can do. Yes, her S3 opener is going to be brutal, but there's nothing you can do about that anyway, right? Because you didn't draft Speed Contester. But after that, let's look at the rest of this team. F10A's S3 has a long cooldown. This team has no provoke, so there's no way for her to proc her S2 after that initial redirected provoke. So, as annoying as she is, after that opener, she is not a high priority threat. A lot of players love tunneling into F10A, and I never understand why. Unless you anticipate the match dragging out long enough for her to drop a second S3, it's almost always better to focus something else instead of burning all your best skills to kill a hero that's basically doing nothing but tickling you with her S1 for the next few turns. Now let's talk about number two. What is the enemy going to consider his highest priority threat? This is important because the same assessment you made for yourself, you should also assess what the enemy is going to do. It's usually not hard, it's usually pretty obvious what you're going to go for, but you're going to want to try your best to kind of interrupt that plan, right? Whatever hero they're trying to kill, try to control or provoke or do whatever you can to stop their strongest DPSs from going on that hero because they want to kill that for a reason, right? So basically, all you have to learn about this is try and disrupt their strategy. Now, let's go into an example to kind of show you how win conditions work. Let's take this hypothetical, kind of bizarre draft. You got through Champ Zerato, Sage Ball, DN, and Crow. And let's say the other guy got through G Purge, LQC, FCC, Carrot. I'll give you like 5 seconds here. Tell me what the win conditions for each player are. All right. Well, the win condition for Team 1U obviously is you got to kill that LQC, right? You got to kill the LQC. And the win condition for player 2 is obviously kill the champion Zerato. Why? I gave you this example for a reason. It's very easy to understand. For Team 1, LQC is the only thing that has a reasonable chance of killing the champion Zerato. General Purges, FCC, Carrot all have debuffs on their S1, and G Purge and FCC S3s alone are not going to kill a champion Zerato. So essentially, if LQC is off the board, Champ Zerato can literally 1v3 that team. So, as Team 1, you need to kill the only threat to your guaranteed win, which is LQC. But you don't really have that much damage, but you have Sage Ball, so a lot of this match will probably come down to attempting to perma control the LQC with the Sage Ball. Now, if you're Team 2, obviously your win condition is kill the champion Zerato, because as we just discussed, if you don't kill it, he's going to solo your team. So it's a very easy choice here. And the thing is, Zerato existing kind of makes it hard for Carrot to even use her S3, right? Because if she does, Champsy is going to start sending burns back at her. So this was a very simple example of a win condition, but with every match, and again, sometimes it's not as obvious as this, but with every match, you should always start off with an idea of what you have to kill to win. Let's move on. All right, so now we're going to go towards more just general advice. So now we're going to talk about hero roster. And basically, the important part here is you need a deep roster. You need answers to everything. People will, of course, ask, what's more important, heroes or gear? The cop out answer is both. But in my personal opinion, the real answer is heroes. Now, if you have a deep roster, but they're all geared like complete garbage, yeah, it doesn't work. But let's assume that a hero with perfectly max rolled gear in every slot gets a rating of 100. So that's the perfect ideal hero build, which no one has. If you can get your roster to have an average value of 75, let's say 75% of its max potential for most of your bruisers and knights and stuff, it's good enough. Now, Cleave, with its dependence on speed, is a lot stricter and harder to build. But if you have a deep hero roster of units with like a 75 to 80% maximum potential gear score, I honestly believe having 75 units geared at 80% is preferable to having 30 heroes geared at 100%. Because options are everything in RTA. I've said it multiple times if you follow this channel. Here's a quick way to tell if you're having a problem with your hero pool. When you draft, do you often find yourself, once you get to the 4 or 5 pick phase, scrolling through your hero list completely at a loss as to what to pick because none of your options sound good? Well, that's the most obvious symptom of having gaps in your hero roster. If you go up against someone with a huge roster, you're going to lose. Let's take a player that has a big. Most players with big rosters, one common thing you'll notice is that they very often draft pretty quickly. Unless you're drafting in such a weird way that they literally can't figure out what you're doing. But in the general sense, they draft pretty quickly because they have viable, geared options and answers to everything you can pick. And that's what makes them good. Because having the right draft, many times, is a lot more important than gear, especially in bruiser versus bruiser situations. When it comes to cleave versus cleave, oftentimes it just becomes a gear check because whoever goes first wins 90% of the time. But in a typical bruiser matchup, like even in Legend, most matches are bruiser versus bruiser. Minor gear disparities don't make that much of a difference. The hero draft is far more important. So again, there's really not that much you can do about this other than play the game. But as you progress, every time I want you to keep a log of when you play matches, if you find that you wish you had a specific hero built that you would love to draft, but you can't because you don't have it, if that comes up multiple times, then that's the hero you should draft. I'll give you a personal example. Last season, I kept running into Carrot. I didn't have many good answers to Carrot. Every time I ran into Carrot, I was like, damn it, I wish I had Kisei. Once Carrot became super meta and everyone spammed her, I decided to build my Kisei. And suddenly, Carrot was still annoying, but not as much of a panic situation because now I finally had a hero I could pick that did very well against her. So that's what you should be doing as well. If you find that you can't deal with popular meta heroes, think of what hero would counter them, and that should be next on your list to build. And you keep doing that over and over and over, and eventually you'll have a bunch of heroes with decent gear, and drafting is going to be way easier for you. Let's move on. Next piece of advice is immunity gear. You're gonna need a lot of immunity gear. I'm a strong believer in that almost every unit you use in competitive RTA should have immunity. Now, there are some Legend players that disagree. They don't think that the loss in stats is worth the immunity. I agree with them for very specific heroes. The only time you can forego immunity, in my opinion, is if the hero's turn 1 is not important. For example, Ravi. On her turn 1, she doesn't really do anything. Her attack is not ramped up, so who cares if they stun her first turn, right? It's not a big deal. For any other hero in the game where their turn 1 is critically important, you absolutely want them to have immunity. Otherwise, they can't fulfill their role. Like imagine your Hyafin gets stunned and she can't S3 and cleanse the debuffs. She's useless then. The other exception is if it's a hero that naturally runs extremely high effect resist. Then you don't need immunity because most likely they're going to just resist whatever it is anyway. In all other situations, my strong advice is that all your favorite PvP units be on immunity gear because the turn 1 will make or break you. Season 1, I had no immunity gear. I can't tell you how many matches I lost just to speed Arby's because they'd blind my most important DPSs like Alencia, Estene, and I would just brick all their moves and miss and automatically lose. Once you get immunity gear on all your units, that starts going away. Some people say immunity is not important because it's going to get stripped anyway. No, it's not. And also, it gives you an extra check because if they fail to strip the immunity, you'll keep everything else. Whereas if you didn't have it, you don't have that extra check. Like for example, like Flurry's S3 has multiple checks, like a defense break, it could provoke, it could strip. If it gets the 2 checks on the defense break and provoke but fails on the immunity, then you resist all 3 anyway. So It's very, very important to get immunity gear. Here's some cheats if you're struggling. Here's your pro tip. Don't craft right side immunity gear. Why? Because getting the right subs is hard enough. If you're also trying to get the right main stat, it gets so much harder to get the right gear, right? Because you ever have that piece of gear that has perfect subs, but it's flat defense or something? It's so annoying. For immunity, you only really need two pieces to complete the set, right? And here's the cheat code. Always get the immunity chest from Hellraid. The immunity chest is fantastic. Even on a Soul Weaver, just forge out the crit chance and change it to something else if you don't want crit chance. Otherwise, most bruisers need all these stats anyway: health, defense, speed, crit chance. It's perfect. After that, just craft weapons and helmets, and as long as you get them with decent subs, it's easy. You got your two pieces, you can complete the immunity set, and you can very quickly this way start putting all your favorite DPS units, bruisers, knights on immunity. Yeah, the health thing is 88 and can't be reforged, but they're 88 so you lose minimal stats. Do your A13 runs, doesn't matter if your team sucks. Like I said, craft your left hand weapons and armor. Ignore this, like when you get real late game and you want to get ideal pieces, find crafties. But in the beginning, when you're just trying to fill out immunity sets, focus on weapons and helmets, and it'll make your life much easier and you'll get geared up much faster. But get immunity. So, hunts. Obviously, the vast majority of this game is farming. Yeah, it's boring, it's stupid. It is what it is. So, what should you be farming? Well, here is my honest breakdown. 95% of the time, you should be running Wyvern. 4% of the time, you should be running A13. And 1% of the time, you should be running Banshee. Why that breakdown? Speed set is the king. Almost every unit in the game works on speed set. You're gonna need a lot of speed sets, you're gonna need a lot of speed. So, you should be farming Wyvern. Almost every top player farms Wyvern 90+% of the time. E13, why do you need to farm it? Just to finish immunity sets. We just talked about it. Immunity sets are very important, and you can also pick up some rage sets so that you can build even faster hunt teams, because most one-shot hunt teams require rage set. As for Banshee, I say 1% because I'm not a Banshee gamer. If you really love counter units and lifesteal units, you can do a little bit more Banshee. But the thing about most lifesteal units is you can run them fine on speed. Like a lot of Legend players were running S10A on lifesteal. It's fine on speed too. That's what people used to do in the past anyway. There are a few units that really need lifesteal and excel on it. Things like Tempest Surin, but honestly, some people run speed T Surins as well. But some heroes like Riolet, T Surin, Champ Z, they do work very well with lifesteal. But yeah, you can probably do a little bit of Banshee just to gear up those niche units. After that, just avoid it. Counter set, yeah, it's good on specific heroes, things like Ravi. But again, I barely do any Banshee, and just from doing things like World Boss and just randomly drops and Hell Raid, you can usually slowly fill out sets without grinding it too much. Whereas speed sets, you're almost always lacking on it, and if you're a cleaver, even the crit sets help a lot. So definitely Wyvern, Wyvern, Wyvern. Basically, that breaks down to if you do 100 runs, 95 of them should be Wyvern, 4 of them should be Azumatic, and 1 should be Banshee. And you do that over the long run, and in my opinion, you should have a reasonable breakdown of gear in terms of sets. And you can actually see it here. You can see that the vast majority of my gear is speed and crit set. And then you're going to see I have almost no lifesteal or counter sets because I'm not a Banshee gamer. I have more immunity sets than both of those combined. And honestly, most of these pieces suck anyway. They're probably like not even fully enhanced. So yeah, like all this junk right here. So I'm not a Banshee gamer. If you want to do more, that's up to you. But realistically, Wyvern, 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 Wyvern. Let's move on. Our final piece of advice for section 3, we're going to talk about packs. Now I know a lot of you might be F2P, but this is going to be especially relevant to you guys who are going to move on to part 4, pushing Legend. The reality is, if you're F2P, you're probably not going to make Legend. Yeah, there's a very small number of exceptions. Almost all of those are day one players, and most of you are probably not day one players. Let's get real. So let's talk about the packs. Well, the best value by far, monthly packs. If you're serious about this game at all, you need to have these. These are the best bang for the buck. There's a huge difference between the players who buy these two packs and the ones who don't. It's a lot of free sky stones, a lot of free energy. Well, I guess it's not free, you're paying for it. A lot of extra sky stones, a lot of extra energy. On top of that, the big whales out there, they're buying leaf packs. Why? Because energy is progression in this game. Because basically, the difference between a godly player and a good player is gear. And how do you get that gear? Spamming Wyvern nonstop. Like the best player in the world, he's probably literally running Wyvern 24/7 with Sky Stones and Leaves. Molagora packs, it's not here right now in this rotation, but Mola packs are huge. Why? Because we talked about how you need a deep hero pool. It means you need a lot of Molas, because otherwise you can't use them because they're not going to be skill enhanced. Mystic packs. You're probably going to need these as well, for that aforementioned reason. Hero pool. The ML5s tend to be very strong in this game. Now, if you're smart about it, you can skip kind of the crappier ones, but keep in mind, a lot of times they end up getting buffed. So if you skip them and they get buffed, you miss out. Perfect example in the background right here. Maid was considered, well, she was good, and then they considered her a dead hero, and then they buffed the crap out of her, and she became meta defining. So you never know. If you skip an ML5, you do it at your own risk. Most super serious PvPers, if they're not F2P or, whatever, they'll buy enough mystic medals to essentially guarantee that they get every ML5. This sounds very hard to do. Same thing with pulling every RGB, but it's different. Because a lot of these players have every ML5 already, which means they get to skip every other banner. And between being in a good guild that gets 5x rewards, buying the mystics in the shop and all the other ways to get them, they actually end up not having to buy very much of these to keep up unless they literally pity every single banner. But if they get lucky at all, it's not nearly as expensive as you would think. So a lot of players do end up getting every single ML5. Now I know some other people also buy these equipment packs. I don't like them, but it just depends on RNG, right? If you end up getting good gear from this, it's not a bad value. I bought like one or two in the past, and they were garbage, so I just stopped ever buying them. But this is absolutely mandatory. This, I'm going to say a lot of top players do it. And the Burning Passion packs are special, so they're not always there, but always buy those. No better bang for the buck than that, other than the monthlies. So that's it for packs. Again, if you're F2P, ignore this section. But for those of you who are trying to get Legend, or even some players who are trying to get Emperor, I mean, it is top 1,000, and there's a hell of a lot more than 1,000 people buying packs in this game. So if you're going up against other Emperor players, chances are they're spending money, and if you're not, you're at a disadvantage. But don't get discouraged. I'm 100% sure you can get Emperor being completely F2P as long as your account's at least like a year and a half old. So now let's move on to section 4, pushing Legend. If you have no interest in doing that, you can turn the video off here, and I hope you guys enjoyed. For the rest of you, let's move on. So section 4. This is only for those of you interested in pushing Legend, and maybe to a lesser degree those of you pushing Emperor. For anyone else, you're not really going to have to go to this extent, so you could probably just turn off the video at this point, like I said previously. But pushing Legend is a completely different animal, right? You're not just trying to kind of be decent at the game, you're trying to be one of the best at the game. In any given World Arena season, something around 100,000 people will step foot into it. So to be top 100 is tough, because guess what? If you're going up against top 100 players, you're going up against some of the smartest E7 players, and on top of that, some of the biggest whales out there. Like we all know that the E7 world champion has spent something around 150 G's on this game and hired people to do hunts for him. That's the kind of stuff you're up against. So you're going to have to do some crazy stuff to be able to rank with those people, to beat them on a regular basis. You're going to need to have a great hero pool, great gear, and on top of all that, you're going to have to really know what you're doing in terms of drafting. And the worse your gear is, the better drafter you better be to make up for it. So let's just get into some little tips and advice I have for those of you trying to push Legend. All right, so first of all, reality check time. If you're F2P, you're probably not making Legend. I'm not saying this to demoralize you or to be an a-hole, but the trademark of my channel has always been shooting straight. I don't hype up heroes that are garbage, I don't clickbait for views, straight shooting. And that's the straight truth. If you hate people who buy packs and think they're scum, that's fine, but don't expect to get to the top. Now, yes, there are definitely exceptions, because supposedly there are a few F2P Legend players. I guarantee you, all those exceptions are day one or very close to day one players who have been playing very efficiently their entire E7 career and have been very lucky to boot with rolls and summons. In other words, most likely not you. Like, I'm a whale. For those of you who've been following me from the beginning, you know I haven't always been a whale, but you do also know that most of my YouTube revenue has went back into the game. So I'm a whale now. My total spend, I think, was something around 5K. You can watch my account review video for that. But if you're one of those players who are not willing to buy packs for any reason, you will most likely never make Legend, because Legend RTA means that you're one of the best players in the entire world, not just your region, like global, Asia, Korea, whatever, the world, because RTA combines all those ladders. What's the problem with that? It means you're 100% going to be fighting whales. Is it fair? No. But you joined a gotcha game. But if you joined a gotcha game thinking it would be fair, you were delusional. Gotchas are for filthy, degenerate, scumbag gamblers. Like me. To some extent, it is and always will be pay to win. Of course, there are great players who spend nothing and own. There are garbage players who spend tens of thousands and still suck. But at the end of the day, odds are that to be in the top 100, those players will most likely be both good and both spending. And that's all there is to it. Anyone who actually knows anything about this game knows that power level, if you want to call it that, is essentially a function of energy. On average, the player who spends more energy will be more powerful, unless they've been super dumb and inefficient throughout their entire E7 career. Someone who spent 10 million energy is going to be much stronger than someone who spent 1 million energy. And a player that spent 100 million energy will be much stronger than that guy who spent 10 million energy, which again is why the number one player in the world is a nutcase who literally grinds hunts 24/7 and spends six figures on the game. That's why he's so strong. Now, I'm not trying to demoralize you, just trying to set realistic expectations. Even if you're F2P, you can still be a great player. You can be champion 100%, no question, very easily if you play right. And you should also have a really solid shot at getting Emperor as F2P if you're a very strong drafter with strong mechanics. But Legend is most likely out of the question unless you've already been Legend in the past. You're a day one player and you're way more talented and lucky than me. There's probably less than what, 10 or 20 F2P Legend players in the world, and a lot of them I'm pretty iffy about because they claim to be F2P, but they always like to sneak in there like, I might have bought a pack or two or, something. Like, I would love to see their paid Skystone thing and see if they legitimately ever spent zero and have them show their Android play history live. Because I think a lot of the quote unquote F2P players, I think they use it as a badge of honor. And then it's like, well, you seem to have a lot of paid Skystones for an F2P player. But who knows? So, anyways, just wanted to set some realistic expectations. Let's move on. Pro tip: have friends who also are going for Legend and compete in High Legend. Now, I'm not following my own advice here because this is something I didn't have because no one else in my guild at the time cared about pushing for Legend RTA, and I honestly don't talk to any other Legend players in any capacity. In the past, I used to, like, the highest, I guess, tier players to talk to in the past was like Liminal, but As far as I know, he's not really active anymore. So on the bright side, I did have a guildie who watched a lot of the top streamers, and he would actually see me on their streams sometimes. And a lot of times he would give me some really helpful advice because he would tell me how other people are beating them and what they're struggling with dealing with. And it was super helpful. So even though he wasn't really competing in Legend, the fact that he was watching their streams was actually very helpful to me. And I could only imagine how much more help I could have had if I chatted with someone else in Legend RTA on a daily basis, and if I had other Legend players to just have fun and do mock RTA lobbies with, theory craft things, ways to beat things, letting each other know how we beat someone's draft. You know, problem is I've always been kind of a control freak. I wanted like my own guild. That's the reason why I never joined a different top 100 guild. But honestly, it's a disadvantage. So if you're serious and want to be a legend player and think you have what it takes, join a top guild. Not just in E7, but in life. You want to surround yourself with people smarter than you, right? People better than you. Find out what makes them better and work to get to their level. It will serve you well in the end. And I know I didn't take my own advice, but that's because anyone who knows me in real life knows I'm very stubborn and want to do everything on my own. But hey, for me, it usually works out because I'm a goddamn squirrel. But if you absolutely can't get a crew of top competitors to bounce ideas off of, kind of do what my guildie did for me. Join one of the many E7 Twitch streams out there. I think most top players are not YouTubers. They're like the what do you call them? Like Twitchers or something? I don't know if there's a verb for it. Watch one of those Twitchers, and I guess I recommend like Light maybe, and I think Elf Mage is one, and I'm sure there are some other ones. So go watch their streams and see what they're doing, see what how they're adjusting to drafts and stuff. If you can't get someone to actually talk to on a regular basis that is in Legend, and I think you'll be able to learn a lot from that. Let's move on. Let's talk about the mental aspect, which is very important. You need to have tough skin to be a Legend player. Yeah, I know some of the top players make it look really easy, and for a small handful of them, honestly, it is. There's maybe like 10 or 20 players who just outgear everyone so goddamn bad that they can prance into Legend whenever they want, freaking steamroll people. I'll tell you right now that 80% of Legend players are not that. 80% of people who finish Legend could have easily finished 150, 110, or even been that super unlucky bastard whoever got 101. A lot of players who deserved Legend didn't make it, and I'm sure a handful who didn't deserve Legend did, because they got a really lucky streak in the final few minutes. It is what it is. So if you're in that 80% of players who are good enough to cut it, but not good enough to guarantee it, you're going to have to be tough. You're going to have those moments where you lose nonstop. My personal record starting in Legend is 11 consecutive losses in a row. Mentally draining because you start thinking like, God damn, I suck. Can I do this? You just got to plow through it. It happens to everyone. I mentioned this before because I've ran into players who are top 50 Legend and I'll queue into them an hour later and they're below 200 champion. Whoops, that dude had a bad run. And half the time I would check the next day and they're back in Legend. It's just about persistence. It happens. Don't be one of those stupid losers that blames every single loss on RNG or blames it on them being a whale and cry about it. Like, whatever. You need to be analytical about every match. Yes, you will lose matches to RNG. Every single top player in the game has lost matches to strings of ludicrous RNG. If it happens, it sucks. Eat the loss, move on, it's fine. What's not okay is blaming losses on RNG when it actually wasn't RNG. You ever see those players who, if anything proc based happens, they freak out and say it's terrible RNG? A hero countering once after they get hit 5 times, that's not bad RNG, that's just probability, it's 20%. A player procking Alexas is really not RNG, it's 40%. It's basically a coin flip every turn. It's going to happen a lot. You need to understand the odds of everything happening to understand if it was actually bad RNG or not. And if it wasn't RNG, you need to figure out what you did wrong that cost you the game. The only real garbage RNG in this game is dual attacks. Like, if you get dual attacked twice in a row, feel free to throw your keyboard out the window because that's garbage and everyone's going to get pissed about that. But you need to have a tough skin. You need to learn, this is key, to enjoy your losses. Don't be afraid to lose. Don't be a sore loser. I lost so much last season and it made me such a better player. Failure is the greatest teacher. The most educational moments last season for me was when the same player beat me more than twice in a row with nearly identical drafts. Because what did that tell me? I'm doing something very wrong and this guy has my number. What can I do to adjust? A personal example, in the beginning of last season, I had a lot of trouble dealing with double Soul Weaver, double DPS drafts like Ruel DN XX, usually like S10A Landy. I played offensive bruiser a lot and it just didn't seem to work well against that. So what did I do? I started drafting double Soul Weaver and just running it myself and seeing how other players beat me. And I just started copying that and it got a lot better. Learn from your losses because you know what? Winning doesn't teach you a damn thing. It just reinforces your ego and it just tells you that you're a great player and you're the best and you don't have to learn anything. If you keep winning, why change anything, right? Winning is a garbage teacher. Losing on the hand makes you feel like garbage, it shames you, it embarrasses you, and most importantly, motivates you into getting better. As long as you're willing to let it. So embrace your losses. Last season, I think I lost over, I don't know, 700 times, and I'm thankful for every one of them because every single one of those losses was part of the reason I finished Legend, and I know I wouldn't have gotten there without them. So be mentally tough, you're going to need it. Next pro tip, get in Legend early and stay there. I think this is very important. You know what a really terrible way to learn how to beat Legend players is? Never playing Legend players. Some people think that they're going to stay in Champion all season and magically crush Legend players in the last 2 days of the season. Sure, is it possible? Yeah, I mean, quite a few players actually do this, but those players are usually multi legend RTA season finishers with godly gear who bully their way to the top in the last day or two. In other words, most likely not you if you're watching this video, because those kind of guys are not interested in watching RTA guides. Being legend throughout the season helps a lot. I learned this in season 4. Fighting mid champions and fighting legend players is not the same. The gear differential is huge, the talent differential is huge, and a champion meta is often a few weeks behind the legend meta because it trickles down, right? People start copying what people are doing in legend, but it takes a while to get down to champion. If you don't play legend players, you won't know how to adjust, you won't have the experience, and you'll probably have nerves. Early in like season 1 and 2, when I went up against a legend player, I was like, oh my god, I'm probably gonna lose, and I'd make dumb decisions. But by the end of season 4, I mean, I'd been playing them all season. It literally meant nothing to me. I didn't even care if they had an E7 world champion frame because I'd played them so many times throughout the season. I just kind of knew them at that point. It was just like whatever. And it makes it much easier to make sound decisions when you don't kind of get nervous by running into these people. So, in general, if you want to end Legend, my best advice is to be Legend regularly throughout the season because you're going to want to lose to Legend players so that you can learn from those losses. Losing to lower quality players will not prepare you properly for the beatings that top players will give you. And you're going to want to take notes and stuff on these players as well throughout the season, which we're going to get into right now. But basically, the gist of it is get in Legend early, stay there, fight Legend players often. It's the only way to get experience, trial by fire. Let's move on. Next pro tip, keep a log. Now, some elitists are going to laugh at this and be like, oh, who's going to bother keeping logs? Well, if you're not a super whale that spent tens of thousands of dollars in the game, you're going to need some way to get an edge. And again, RTA is all about information. So this is going to help with information. So if you have an eidetic memory, you don't need this, but I don't. I'm the kind of person who, I'll meet someone, they'll tell me their name. 30 seconds later, I already forgot who they are. So I needed to write this down because otherwise I didn't have a chance in hell of remembering any of it. So what information you need to write down is highly individual. Like I've been maintaining this throughout the season, so a lot of it is just garbage here that I don't even really care about. But by the end of the season, it really boiled down to three things for me. Number one, do they have maid? Number two, do they have BMH? Number three, are they cleavers? Why did I only care about those three pieces of information? Well, one and two is because I didn't have maid or BMH. Not having BMH, I struggled mightily with maid teams. So if they had maid, pre-banned it 100% of the time, even if they also cleave sometimes. Number two, BMH. That's a specialized thing for me. It's because I'm a degenerate RB picker. Not a degen RB, but I just love picking RB. I pick him every time if I can. So if they had BMH, I knew I could not 1, 2, 3, potentially 4 pick him. So if they had BMH, I avoided picking RB unless it was a 5 pick. But that was special to me just because I loved RB so much. Number three, do they cleave? It was because my drafting style was weak to cleave, because one of my favorite first picks was Blue Prow. You know what Blue Prow sucks against? Cleave. So I had to know that they were cleavers, and I could draft kind of more agnostic units early, like a G Purge or something, so I didn't immediately start a match against a cleaver one unit down. So by the end of the season, that's really all I cared about. I also had some special notes on people, sometimes with things like speed, and that helped too. But honestly, I almost never read that column by the end. But it was good to have some special information if they ran into something you like really unusual. Like this guy, I burst him once, and his Tomoka outsped my. Like I thought I had won the draft, and then this Tomo outsped my Cerise at like 290 something. So I literally just wrote, "Don't speed contest this guy," because I saw that and I was like, okay, this guy has some retardedly good speed gear. Don't mess with him. So I wanted to know that going forward. Or there was some guy who ran a weird Landy team. This guy. I wrote 270 Landy because he beat me like multiple times in a row because I kept getting confused because I thought like a typical Landy is like 190 to 220 speed. But he built his Landy super fast and used it as an initiator, and he kept pseudo cleaving me because it didn't look like a true cleave. But after losing to that multiple times, I figured I need to write this down because I keep losing to the same thing because I kept forgetting who he was. And keeping this kind of log, no joke, increased my overall win rate in Legend probably by at least 5 to 15%. Again, drafting is all about information. Knowing what heroes they have is huge. And for me, knowing whether they had Mead or BMH, the only two heroes in the game that I really struggled dealing with, that was incredibly important information to have for me. Now, again, your 1, 2, 3 will very likely be different. Like a Cleaver's 1, 2, 3 is going to be very different from my 1, 2, 3. I'm an offensive bruiser player. But the point is, keep logs of people. Now, to get onto my list, basically, if you had an RTA legend frame, or if I ran into you multiple times near legend, basically the general rule of thumb was if I expected that I might run into you on the final day of the RTA season, I put you on the list. Although not always, because a lot of times, like I play on my phone and this sheet is on my laptop. So if I played you on my phone, I wasn't going to go run to my laptop and write it down. So there's probably a bunch of people that are missing. I'm going to scroll through this just for funsies in case any of these players ever want to look at my list and see what notes I took on them. But in general, it's not even very well maintained. Like Mace, all I wrote was ban made. I really don't know anything about him other than that. I guess I knew he had a fast flurry too. But yeah, like if you're gonna play hundreds of matches anyway, people will be like, "Who's gonna spend the time to do this?" Uh, Look at the notes here. Each row is like anywhere from 1 to 5 words. It took me 1 to 2 seconds to write these notes. If you're gonna play 1,000 matches in an RTA season, that's like what, like 50 hours of RTA? Wouldn't you rather invest the 10 to 15 minutes it takes to write these notes to increase your win rate if you're going to invest that much time into playing the game anyway? It's definitely worth it. Don't be elitist. Do whatever it takes to win. And a lot of top players I know are doing this anyway. Why? Because people started pre-banning stuff against me that no one pre-bans. Like I was an LR Crow spammer, and suddenly people started pre-banning LR Crow, and like Sage Ball against me. For those of you who don't know, last season, LR Crow and Sage Ball were not normal things to pre-ban. So definitely those guys started seeing what heroes I like using, and they were targeting pre-bans on me. So everyone does this. Don't feel bad about it. Abuse it. Information is king. Let's move on. All right, boys, it's been a journey. By far the longest guide video I've ever made. But now, you're all honorary graduates of RTA University. You should have all the information and knowledge you need to enter World Arena and succeed and grow. Whether that means just getting to Masters so you can lock in one of those RTA skins, or the few of you who are actually interested in pushing all the way up to Legend to try and chase one of those sweet, glorious Legend RTA frames. I wish all of you the best of luck, and make sure to leave in the comment section if you think I forgot anything or left anything out. And of course, there's a lot of it because this video was primarily about fundamentals. But if you guys want me to elaborate on anything, if I see a common theme, I'd be happy to do a follow-up video on that. Whatever it takes to get you in there and succeed. So anyways, thanks for watching, best of luck, and as always, keep on grinding. Till next time, boys, peace out.